All right, let's settle a debate that has probably happened in your own home. If you have an orchid, someone has almost certainly told you to water it with ice cubes. Just pop a few on top and you're good to go. But is this a genius plant hack, or is it a horticultural crime? Well, the answer is way more interesting than you'd think.
So yeah, the big question, is this super common piece of advice actually good for your plants? It's a classic battle, you know? Convenience versus what might actually be best for the orchid. And people have some strong opinions on this one.
Look, the idea behind the ice cubes is pretty simple. They melt slowly so you don't accidentally drown the roots, which, let's be honest, is super easy to do. But here's the thing. The biggest concern from the experts isn't really about the cold. It's about what that slow trickle of water doesn't do. It never really flushes through the pot.
And that gets us to the heart of the problem, summed up perfectly by an orchid grower online. It's not about one single watering. It's about the long-term health of the plant. See, without a good, solid flow of water washing through, all the minerals from your tap water and the salts from your fertilizer just sit there. They build up over time and can eventually become toxic to the roots.
But you know, all this initial worry about the cold does raise a really cool question. How do plants out in the wild actually deal with freezing temperatures? Turns out they have a pretty sophisticated game plan.
It's a whole process called cold hardening. And it's not just about toughing it out. The plants are actively changing their internal chemistry. They start producing things like sugars that act like a natural antifreeze, and they reinforce their cell walls to keep sharp ice crystals from forming inside and basically shredding them from within. It's amazing stuff.
And get this, the difference it makes is absolutely staggering. A plant that hasn't had time to prepare might die if the temperature dips to just -5 degrees Celsius. But that exact same plant, after it's gone through cold hardening, it can survive temperatures as low as -30. That is an incredible feat of adaptation.
So it's pretty clear plants are surprisingly tough when it comes to the cold. But what about the opposite stress? What happens when there's not enough water? Understanding how plants handle drought is another huge piece of this puzzle. And for the scientists who study it, it's a real challenge.
So here's the problem a team of researchers ran into. Trying to simulate a natural drought in a lab is really tricky. You can't just stop watering a plant in a pot. The soil dries out way too fast, and it's not at all like what happens in nature. So they had to figure out a way to create a slow, gradual, and perfectly controlled drought.
And their solution was just brilliantly simple. They actually looked back at an old method from the 80s and tweaked it, and it let them build the perfect drought right there in their lab.
Okay, so here's how they did it. They took the potted plants and set them on top of a big block of that green floral foam, you know, the stuff you use for flower arrangements. Then, by slowly lowering the water level in the tub, the foam would wick less and less moisture up to the plant's soil. It perfectly mimicked how a drought slowly sets in over time.
And would you look at that? It worked like a charm. So on this graph, you've got soil moisture on the vertical axis and time over 35 days on the horizontal. See those blue dots? Those are the control plants, nice and happy with consistent water. But the red dots, those are the drought plants. You can see that perfect, slow, steady decline, exactly what they wanted.
But here is one of the wildest things they found. A plant that doesn't have enough water can't cool itself down. And the study found that the leaves on the thirsty plants got up to 8 degrees Celsius hotter than the well-watered ones. That's a huge difference, putting them at serious risk of basically cooking in the sun.
This whole experiment allowed the scientists to figure out the exact moment a plant hits its Turgor loss point. It sounds technical, but it's really just the sciencey term for something we've all seen. Wilting. It's that point where the plant cells have lost so much water pressure that they just can't hold themselves up anymore.
Okay, so we've looked at how plants handle the crazy extremes of cold and drought, and all this science brings us right back to our orchid on the windowsill. What does it actually want from us? The answer, it turns out, isn't really in a lab. It's in its own family history. Okay, this is probably the single most important thing to understand about most of the orchids we keep. They are epiphytes. That means in the wild, they don't grow in dirt, they grow clinging to the sides of trees, with their roots totally out in the open air.
And this is what a happy orchid root system is supposed to look like. They're not your normal roots, are they? These thick, white, almost alien-looking things are designed to do a few things. Cling to bark, absorb humidity from the air, and most importantly, to breathe. They want the exact opposite of sitting in dense, soggy potty necks.
So if you think about it, an epiphyte's wish list is all about air and drainage. It wants a sudden downpour, and then it wants the air to circulate and dry its roots out. And now we see the problem with the ice cubes, right? That slow little dribble never gives the roots the good flushing rinse they need to wash away all those built up salts.
You know, the pros have a really clever trick for this. They often use clear plastic pots. And why would they do that? Well, because an orchid's roots can actually photosynthesize. They can make food from light, just like the leaves do. How cool is that? Giving them some light encourages them to stay happy right inside the pot. It's a perfect example of working with the plant's nature, not against it. And that brings us right back to the beginning. The whole debate over ice cubes was never really about the temperature. As we've seen, plants are tougher than we give them credit for. It was always about biology. The method just doesn't respect what the plant actually needs. It doesn't give it that drench and dry cycle that its roots have evolved over millions of years to expect.
So maybe the next time you look at any of your plants, not just your orchid, the question isn't what's the easiest hack to keep this alive. Instead, maybe ask, what was this plant designed to do in the wild? Because really, the bigger question this whole debate brings up is, are we actually listening to what our plants are trying to tell us?